Imagine standing in front of a private jet, only to be told you don't belong there. A flight attendant, full of judgment and assumptions, stopped a man from boarding, which he didn't know. The jet wasn't just any jet, it was his. And 7 minutes later, the truth came out in a way that left her speechless and the world stunned. This isn't just another story about someone being underestimated. It's about how quick assumptions can lead to epic embarrassment. A man, treated like he was in the wrong place, proved everyone wrong in the most jaw-dropping way. But it's not just about what he did, it's about what it says about how we treat people, especially when we think we know their story. Stick around, because in just 7 minutes, everything changed. What he said and did. You don't want to miss it. Marcus had just finished one of the most important business trips of his life. A self-made entrepreneur, he had built a successful company from the ground up. He wasn't flashy, he didn't wear designer suits or travel with an entourage. He preferred a more understated approach, which often led people to underestimate him. On this particular day, that assumption would lead to an unforgettable confrontation. As Marcus arrived at the private jet terminal, he felt relieved. He was looking forward to the flight home, where he could unwind on his private jet, a reward for years of hard work. The jet was already prepped, the crew was on board, and everything was running smoothly, or so he thought. Marcus walked confidently toward the plane, dressed casually in a sweatshirt, jeans, and sneakers. Just as he reached the boarding stairs, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Excuse me, sir. Where do you think you're going?" Marcus turned to see a flight attendant standing at the base of the stairs, her arms crossed and her face set in a stern expression. She wasn't welcoming him. She was blocking his path. "This area is restricted to private jet passengers only," she said coldly, her eyes scanning him with a look of disdain. Marcus paused, surprised by her tone. "I know," he replied calmly. "This is my jet." Her eyebrows shot up, and then she laughed a short, dismissive sound that instantly made his blood boil. "Your jet," she repeated, clearly amused. "I think you're confused. Maybe you're looking for the commercial terminal?" The humiliation hit Marcus like a wave. It wasn't just her words, it was the way she said them, dripping with condescension. She didn't see him as a successful businessman, or even as a potential passenger. She saw him as someone who didn't belong. Still, Marcus tried to remain composed. "No," he said firmly. "This is my jet. I own it, and I'm scheduled to board it today." The flight attendant's smile vanished, replaced by an icy glare. "Sir, I don't know what kind of prank this is, but I suggest you leave before I call security." Now, a small crowd had started to gather, other passengers, crew members, and staff in the terminal, all watching the scene unfold. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, their curiosity mingling with judgment. Some whispered to each other, clearly speculating about who he was and why he was being confronted. Despite the growing tension, Marcus decided not to argue further. He didn't want to cause a scene, but he also wasn't going to let the situation slide. He stepped back and crossed his arms, observing how the flight attendant interacted with the other passengers. Within moments, another man approached the plane, a middle-aged white man in a tailored suit, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. The flight attendant's demeanor shifted instantly. Her cold, defensive stance melted away, replaced by a warm, welcoming smile. "Good afternoon, sir," she greeted him cheerfully, stepping aside to let him pass without question. Marcus watched, his frustration mounting. It was painfully clear what was happening. The flight attendant wasn't just making an honest mistake, she was judging him based on his appearance. His casual clothes, his skin color, and his lack of visible status symbols had led her to assume he couldn't possibly belong in the world of private jets. Still, Marcus stayed silent, letting the situation play out. He wanted to see how far this would go. Meanwhile, the whispers around him grew louder. Some of the onlookers seemed to be siding with the flight attendant, nodding in agreement with her actions. Others appeared uncomfortable, perhaps recognizing the injustice, but unsure how to respond. The flight attendant, emboldened by the lack of pushback, turned back to Marcus. "Look," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I don't have time for this. If you don't leave now, I'll have to escalate this situation." Marcus glanced at his watch. It had been nearly 7 minutes since the confrontation began, and he decided enough was enough. He pulled out his phone and made a call, his voice calm but firm. "Could you come outside for a moment?" he said simply. What happened next would change the entire dynamic of the situation. Marcus stood still for a moment, taking a deep breath. His mind raced, but his face remained composed. The flight attendant's words stung, but he wasn't going to let them derail him. Instead, he chose to remain calm. His eyes flicked over to the passengers in the terminal, and he could see the uncertainty on their faces. Some were pretending not to watch, others seemed curious, but none of them seemed to want to speak up. Marcus realized it wasn't just about the interaction between him and the flight attendant. It was about something much larger. The assumptions people make when they look at someone, judging them before hearing their story. The flight attendant, oblivious to Marcus's calmness, seemed to think she had the upper hand. She crossed her arms, tapping her foot impatiently, as if waiting for him to back down. She didn't understand that Marcus had dealt with moments like this his whole life. Moments where people underestimated him or assumed he didn't belong in certain spaces. But he wasn't like other people. He didn't have a chip on his shoulder, nor was he interested in making a scene. The last thing he wanted was to engage in a shouting match. Instead, he knew the best thing to do was to let the situation unfold, because the more the flight attendant pressed, the more she revealed about herself, and the more uncomfortable the people around them would become. "You're not going to let me through, huh?" Marcus asked quietly, keeping his tone steady. The words weren't a question, they were a statement. It was clear now that she wasn't about to back down either. He glanced at his watch, casually checking the time. The longer this dragged on, the more ridiculous the situation felt. What should have been a routine moment of boarding had now escalated into a public spectacle. The flight attendant's posture stiffened. "I already told you, sir, you don't belong here," she said, her voice sharper this time. "If you don't leave right now, I'll have to call security." Marcus didn't flinch. He could feel his patience thinning, but he remained calm. He wasn't going to let her win. "It's fine. I don't want to cause trouble. But this is my plane, and I'm going to board it." The tension hung in the air as the seconds ticked by. Marcus could feel the stares of the people around him. Some of them were starting to realize something wasn't right. The flight attendant was acting like a gatekeeper to a world that she assumed he didn't belong to, and her behavior was making it painfully obvious. The whole situation was beginning to feel surreal, like something you'd see in a movie. A moment of intense unfairness that only seemed to escalate as time passed. Then, just as Marcus was about to speak again, a voice cut through the tension. "Excuse me, is there a problem here?" It was the captain, a tall, middle-aged man in a crisp uniform. He walked towards them with a calm yet authoritative presence. His eyes quickly scanned the scene, taking in the flight attendant's crossed arms and Marcus's composed demeanor. Without missing a beat, he looked at the flight attendant and asked, "What's going on?" The flight attendant blinked, clearly caught off guard. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "This man is trying to board the plane without permission. He doesn't have clearance to be here." Marcus raised an eyebrow, but he didn't speak. He knew the captain wasn't going to just take her word for it. The captain turned back to Marcus, his eyes softening. "Is this true, sir?" Marcus nodded slowly. "Yes, it is," he said simply, still maintaining his calm. "This is my plane. I'm scheduled to board. I don't know why she's insisting otherwise." The captain's eyes narrowed for a moment as he processed the information. He glanced at the flight attendant, whose face had started to flush. It was clear she wasn't expecting this kind of scrutiny. The captain didn't say anything for a few seconds, but his gaze was enough to make the flight attendant shift uncomfortably. "I think we may need to double-check the details," the captain said after a pause, his voice even and professional. He turned and walked toward the plane's entrance, motioning for Marcus to follow. The flight attendant stood there, stunned, as Marcus followed the captain. For a moment, she just watched them, not sure what to do. She probably thought the captain would back her up, that her decision would be reinforced by his authority. But Marcus wasn't some random passenger, and this wasn't going to play out the way she thought. As the captain and Marcus boarded the plane, Marcus couldn't help but feel a twinge of frustration. This was exactly the kind of situation he'd been trying to avoid, being treated like an outsider, like someone who didn't belong in a place he'd worked so hard to get to. It wasn't just about the jet, it was about the bigger picture. It was about the way people's biases shape the way they treat others. And it was a reminder of how easy it was to be misjudged based on appearance alone. But he didn't dwell on it. Instead, he focused on the task at hand. He knew what needed to be done. He had to stay composed. He needed to prove to the flight attendant, to the onlookers, and even to himself that he wasn't going to let anyone's assumptions define who he was. He was Marcus Carter, and he had built this jet with his own hands, his own efforts. Nothing, no one could take that away from him. As he made his way into the cabin, the captain spoke with the crew in private for a moment, confirming Marcus's identity. The rest of the staff, who had witnessed the confrontation, were now realizing the truth of the situation. The uncomfortable looks exchanged between them told the story. They had been complicit in assuming something about Marcus they shouldn't have. The longer this dragged on, the clearer it became what was happening wasn't just an isolated moment of ignorance. It was an example of how easy it was to judge someone based on nothing more than their outward appearance. And in that moment, Marcus realized something else. His patience, his decision to not react aggressively, was the key. He wasn't just proving he belonged. He was showing everyone else the power of not letting stereotypes take control. As Marcus entered the plane with the captain, he could feel the weight of the situation on his shoulders. His heart was racing, not because he was nervous or anxious, but because he knew something had to give. The captain had stepped in, which was a relief. But the flight attendant's challenge wasn't just about this moment. It was about the larger assumptions she had made, the biases that had led her to act the way she did. Inside the plane, Marcus took a seat near the front, but he didn't settle in just yet. His eyes scanned the cabin, looking at the luxurious leather seats, the spacious interior. It was a far cry from the cramped commercial flights he used to take before he became successful. But right now, none of that mattered. What mattered was making sure the flight attendant understood that her treatment of him was completely unacceptable. The captain spoke with a couple of the crew members quietly in the galley, and Marcus could hear snippets of the conversation. He could tell that the crew was still processing the situation. The awkwardness hung in the air, but no one dared to speak out until the captain returned to the front. "I just spoke to the operations manager," the captain said as he returned to the cabin. "It seems there was a misunderstanding, but I think we've cleared it up." The words were meant to reassure Marcus, but he could see the discomfort on the captain's face. He could also sense that the crew was now more aware of the tension. A few of them exchanged glances, the awkwardness palpable, but no one said anything out loud. The flight attendant, still standing by the door, had an expression that said it all. She was embarrassed, but she was too proud to admit it. Marcus leaned back in his seat, staring straight ahead. He wasn't going to let her off the hook that easily, though. It wasn't just about getting her to apologize. It was about changing the way people saw him and others like him. This moment could be a turning point. At that moment, the flight attendant approached the captain. Marcus could hear their conversation, though the words were muffled at first. The flight attendant's voice was higher than usual, like she was trying to convince herself that she hadn't done anything wrong. "Captain, I still don't understand why he's allowed on the plane," she said. "He didn't even show a boarding pass." The captain's tone was calm, but there was an undeniable firmness to it now. "Ma'am, I've already spoken with the passenger. He has every right to be here. He owns this plane. Do you need me to show you his flight records?" The flight attendant's face flushed a deep red. She opened her mouth to protest, but quickly closed it, realizing there was no point. She had misjudged Marcus, and she had done so publicly, in front of the crew, in front of the passengers. Now, there was no way to take it back. Marcus could feel the shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't just that the captain had backed him up, it was the realization that the flight attendant was trapped in her own denial. Her pride wouldn't let her admit that she had been wrong, even though it was clear to everyone in the cabin. The discomfort that filled the air became almost tangible as the crew started to realize what had just happened. Then, as if on cue, the flight attendant turned to Marcus, her voice quieter but still laced with tension. "Sir," she said, her words tinged with reluctance, "I'm sorry for the misunderstanding. I didn't realize who you were." Marcus didn't respond right away. He let the silence linger, forcing her to feel the weight of the situation. This wasn't about just saying the words, it was about understanding why she had treated him the way she did. And he wasn't going to let her off the hook just because she'd apologized. After a few moments of silence, Marcus spoke. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that couldn't be ignored. "You didn't realize who I was," he said slowly. "But that's the problem, isn't it? You made an assumption about me based on how I look, based on what you think I should be. I've spent my entire life proving people wrong when they've assumed I don't belong. And I'm still doing it." The flight attendant's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't speak. The truth of his words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Marcus wasn't interested in embarrassing her further, but he also wasn't going to let her walk away from this unscathed. The damage had been done, but maybe, just maybe, she would leave with a little more awareness than when she arrived. The captain stood silently by, watching the exchange. He hadn't expected this confrontation to turn so serious, but he was starting to understand the bigger picture. This wasn't just about a passenger and a flight attendant. It was about the assumptions we all make when we look at someone, the judgments we cast without knowing the full story. He had seen it before in his career, but this time it felt personal. After a long, tense moment, the flight attendant finally spoke again. I understand," she said, her voice quieter now. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter. I truly am. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Marcus nodded once, acknowledging the apology, but not fully accepting it just yet. He wasn't interested in rushing past the moment. This wasn't just about moving on, it was about ensuring this lesson stuck. He wanted her to understand that it wasn't just a mistake, it was a reflection of the biases that exist in all of us, whether we want to admit them or not. The flight attendant took a step back, and the captain finally gave Marcus a nod of approval. "We'll be ready for takeoff soon," he said. "Thank you for your patience." Marcus didn't respond, but his thoughts were clear. This moment wasn't just a story about a mistaken identity, it was a story about what happens when people stop seeing each other as individuals. When we let assumptions guide our actions, we end up hurting people, even when we don't mean to. And while this chapter was over, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this moment had the power to change things not just for him, but for the flight attendant, the crew, and anyone who had witnessed what had happened. As the plane took off, the tension slowly began to dissipate. But Marcus knew that the impact of what had just happened would linger far longer than the flight itself. As the plane leveled out and the tension finally began to ease, Marcus took a deep breath, feeling a sense of calm wash over him. The confrontation with the flight attendant was over, but the impact of what had happened was far from gone. For him, it wasn't just about getting on a plane, It was about making a statement, showing that assumptions and biases can be challenged when we stand up for what's right. The flight attendant, who once saw him as an outsider, now understood the truth. Marcus wasn't just a passenger, he was the owner of the jet. The lesson wasn't lost on her, and as the journey continued, the uncomfortable energy in the cabin slowly faded. But the real takeaway? That the next time anyone sees someone, they might pause and think twice before jumping to conclusions. Because every person's story deserves to be heard, not judged. Want more stories that challenge assumptions and inspire change? Subscribe and don't miss what's coming next. This is not a real story. It's a work of fiction,